Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is an action-adventure game developed by Respawn Entertainment and published by EA in November of this year. And while it released a bit too late in the year to be eligible for a lot of Game of the Year awards, it has been generally very well received and has actually gone on to become the fastest-selling digital launch of any Star Wars game to date. Which is pretty impressive considering that EA really didn't do a lot to hype this one up. They did have a few trailers here and there, and they certainly put out a couple of press releases about it, but they certainly didn't try to hype it up like they did with, say, the Star Wars Battlefront reboots, or even something along the lines of, say, Battlefield 5, or especially their sports games, which is undoubtedly because it's a single-player-only game that's not set up to be monetized at all. And with the general trend of the so-called AAA game industry going heavy into the live service model where they're trying to nickel and dime you for everything they possibly can, a single-player-only game like this is incredibly refreshing to see. But here's the thing, just because it's refreshing to see doesn't necessarily mean it's actually good. So let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out what exactly we're dealing with. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which, unlike pretty much every single EA release over the past several years, does not actually run on the Frostbite engine. Instead, it actually runs on Unreal Engine 4, and they use it to great effect, with a lot of really nice effects, as well as some absolutely fantastic animation during the cutscenes, where the lip syncing is absolutely spot on, and the characters themselves are all extremely expressive. However, once you get out of the cutscenes and into the game proper, and you just walk up to somebody and start talking to them, the lip syncing ends up being a lot more crude and the characters are considerably less expressive, ending up just standing around in one particular spot without much movement going on. So that's a bit disappointing, but the rest of the visuals do help pick up the slack. They've got some really nice texture work going on, the modeling is of course excellent, the animations themselves generally are very well done, although the moves you're actually doing when you're swinging your lightsaber around often look rather clunky and awkward, but that could actually just be due to plot reasons, which I'll explain a bit later on. Aside from that, the lighting is absolutely fantastic, which is one of the big hallmarks of Unreal Engine 4, and they also have some very nice particle effects. And even aside from the visual quality overall being very high, they just do a really good job of absolutely nailing the Star Wars aesthetic, although there is one aesthetic choice which does really bother me, and that is the simple fact that while you can slice and dice the monsters and animals up to your heart's content, and they will just split apart in a glorious fashion, if you're going up against any of the human or near-human enemies in this, they don't dismember. They just get big marks across them and end up falling over. Now, they probably did that to keep the T rating from the ESRB, but let's face it, this is Star Wars and we know what a lightsaber can do. To not have dismemberment on humanoid enemies just seems really weird. And the fact that you can dismember all of the non-human enemies, and in fact a lot of them you can actually slice them entirely in half, just makes that absence all the more glaring. But aside from those fairly small issues and some occasional visual glitches here and there, they've generally done an extremely good job with the visuals, and then when you move over into sound design, things continue to be very high quality. The sound effects all absolutely nail the sound of Star Wars, where blaster fire and lightsaber swings and all that sort of thing all sound absolutely spot on, and they even put in some smaller details here and there, like when you change the color of your lightsaber, it actually changes the activation sound of it as well. And then if you move past the sound effects and go into the soundtrack, you find that not only is it actually an original soundtrack that was composed specifically for the game by Gordy Hobb and Stephen Barton, but it actually still nails the Star Wars vibe without just being the typical John Williams score. It's all high-quality orchestral music that fits the game perfectly, and then once you've gotten past all of that, the voice acting itself is actually very well done. I was a bit skeptical going into it given the trailers, but in actual gameplay, it actually works out very well. That's not to say that there isn't a sour line here or there, but for the most part, all of the actors do an excellent job of giving their characters quite a bit of personality and emotion, and that all lends itself very well to the type of game this is. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you find that overall they've done a fantastic job with it. That's not to say that there aren't some issues here and there, because there certainly are, but it's never anything that's especially problematic. But what would be problematic is if the story and gameplay were not up to par, because that's what really matter in a video game, and in this particular game you play as Cal Kestis, a former Jedi Padawan who managed to escape the initial Jedi purge as of Order 66 at the end of Revenge of the Sith, and has spent the roughly 5 years since hiding out on the planet Bracca where he works as a scavenger. And one day while he's working on some wreckage with his friend Prof, they end up having an accident and he ends up having to use the Force to save Prof's life, and when the Empire finds out about this, they send 2 Inquisitors, the 2nd and 9th Sisters, to find Cal and bring him in. The Inquisitors murder Prof, which causes Cal to lose his composure and become exposed, and thus he has to flee again. And after being chased by Imperial forces, he's rescued by a former Jedi Knight by the name of Cere Junda, along with her partner, the pilot Grease. And after they escape the immediate clutches of the Empire, they flee to the remote planet Bogano, where Cere has Cal open a Force-sensitive vault on the planet, where it's revealed that the Jedi Master Eno Cordova actually hid a holocron containing a list of Force-sensitives throughout the galaxy, which Cere hopes to use to rebuild the Jedi Order, but in order to access the holocron, whoever's trying to get in the vault first needs to follow Cordova's path, which Cal ultimately agrees to do, and thus they end up going all around the galaxy and finding these locations that Cordova visited and left clues behind at, so they can ultimately find a way to access the holocron and keep it out of the hands of the Empire. Along the way, Cal slowly rebuilds his damaged connection to the Force and gradually becomes more and more of the Jedi he was meant to be, all while trying to stay at least one step ahead of the Inquisitors the entire time. And while it's nothing especially unique as far as Star Wars stories in general go, and thus at times it can certainly be rather predictable, the story itself still has a solid progression, and the characters themselves are generally pretty likable and well thought out. And while the pacing is occasionally a bit rough here and there, they've generally just done a very good job with the story overall. Again, it's not that it's necessarily particularly unique or revolutionary or anything like that, it's just that they did a good job telling what they decided to tell. But here's the thing, as solid as the story and characters are, you do have to factor in the gameplay, which I would describe as a bit of a grab bag of mechanics from various genres. The first thing you notice is that it's a third-person action-adventure game in the style of, say, Uncharted or Tomb Raider or something along those lines, with very similar movement mechanics where you climb on a lot of different things, you can shimmy along ledges, you'll run along railings, you'll use ropes or cords or whatever to swing across distances, you'll use zip lines, whatever the case may be. And much like with Tomb Raider, you'll gradually unlock new items as well as new abilities that will allow you to traverse the environment in different ways. So in terms of more Jedi-related things, you'll eventually gain access to things like wall running as well as the Jedi flip, which is just a double jump and things like that. And in terms of general equipment, you might get things like the climbing claws, which will allow you to climb certain surfaces that you weren't ordinarily able to climb. And much like with, say, a Metroidvania, you'll notice these different elements throughout most of the environments you're going through, and you will be able to go back to those environments later on once you've unlocked those various abilities to be able to traverse them and access new areas that might have new secrets or new enemies to fight, or even just be vital to progressing the rest of the story. And as you unlock these new traversal abilities, you'll also be able to unlock additional shortcuts that will allow you to access the different areas a bit more easily instead of having to go around the long way all the time. So the level design is a bit more along the lines of, say, Dark Souls. Which does of course lead me into the combat system, because I've seen a lot of people describe this as similar to Souls combat, but it's really not. It's a lot more along the lines of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which means that instead of the painfully sluggish Souls-like combat experience of just constantly managing your stamina bar, in this one it's really all about timing your blocks perfectly so you parry attacks without losing any of your block meter. Sure, you can hold down the block button and just intercept incoming attacks, but eventually your guard will be broken and that will leave you vulnerable. So you'll want to time your blocks and parry incoming attacks instead, and if you do that, then it actually is extremely beneficial to you because it will throw the enemy off balance and allow you to counterattack, although in some cases it may require multiple counterattacks in order to actually break their guard so you can actually do health damage to them. And unless you're going up against some of the tougher enemies in the game, generally speaking, most enemies will go down in only a few hits, maybe 1 to 3 at most. Obviously that changes once you start fighting the bosses, because they have very large health pools and will take a lot of hits before going down, but the basic principles still apply. You're still going to want to be parrying their attacks as much as you possibly can in order to be able to counterattack more effectively, and of course not have your guard broken. There are, however, some attacks you can't block or parry, and those will be denoted by the enemy that's attacking you turning red briefly before the attack lands, which gives you some time to get out of the way by dodging. And you really have two ways of dodging an attack. You can either go for what is called a precision dodge, where you basically step out of the way of the attack just in time by tapping the dodge button, and then you can follow that up immediately with a counterattack if you have the appropriate skills for it. And then the other type of dodge is when you double tap the button and you try to do a bit of a longer dodge out of the way that leaves you a bit more open at the end of it. And you do have to be careful, because if you're being attacked by multiple enemies, say you've got at least 1 or 2 in melee and then you've got another one shooting at you from range, then you're going to have to be combining your efforts, because you'll have to be dodging attacks that can't be blocked, you'll have to be blocking or parrying attacks that can be parried, and if somebody's shooting at you from a distance, you'll need to be cognizant of what they're actually shooting at you, because if it's a blaster bolt, then you can actually reflect it back at them by parrying it, but if it's, say, a rocket, then you actually have to force push that back at them, or just dodge out of the way. And speaking of force powers, you do get access to 3 of them throughout the course of the game, although you start with access to only 1 of them. That one is Force Slow, which allows you to briefly slow down either objects in the environment, or incoming attacks, or enemies themselves, so you can more readily deal with them. And then the other 2 powers you get are Force Push and Force Pull. And you can utilize all of these in combat by either force pushing enemies onto their backs, or even off of cliffs or things like that, force pulling enemies towards you so you can either impale them with your lightsaber or just put them off of balance, or of course slowing enemies so you can deal with them later, or just go up behind them and start whacking them, or whatever the case may be. And then of course you can also use these powers out of combat to solve various puzzles. Now the thing is, if you're out of combat, then you don't need to worry about using the powers as much as possible, but while you're in combat, you have a force meter. And whenever you use your force powers during combat, that force meter will deplete, and eventually you won't be able to use any more force powers until you replenish it, which you can do by attacking enemies with your lightsaber. This means that combat is a very timing-based affair overall. You're going to be having to time all of your blocks and parries and such, as well as your dodges, and on top of that, you're going to be having to time when you actually go on the offensive, so you can maximize your damage output on enemies without compromising your own defenses. And if you're like me and you play the game on one of the harder difficulties, in my case Jedi Master, then you will find that the combat is actually pretty challenging at times, although obviously the further you get into the game, the easier it's going to get. And this is going to be both due to the fact that as you continue to play the game, obviously you're going to get more used to the combat system and just get better at it, but also the fact that over time you will earn experience points that will gain you upgrade points that you can then spend to upgrade your abilities with additional combos for your lightsaber, as well as things like the lightsaber throw ability, or increasing your force power, or increasing the amount of healing that you get from healing stems, or all sorts of things like that, that just generally make the combat quite a bit easier. Now, of course, if you're playing the game on a lower difficulty, then you generally don't need to worry about that sort of thing anyway, because it's actually really easy unless you play it on one of the harder settings, because the force meter never truly bottoms out once you're playing it on the lower difficulties, and you can just keep spamming the force powers over and over and over again, and the enemies don't do all that much damage to you. Meanwhile, if you're playing on the harder difficulty settings, then you can take a lot fewer hits before going down, and once your force meter actually bottoms out, it stays that way instead of having a reserve that replenishes after a few seconds. So you really can't just brute force your way through the game and end up having to be a lot more careful with how you actually go into the combat. That's not to say you can't make mistakes. You do have healing stems that BD1 can give you that will replenish a small amount of your health, although you can certainly increase the amount of healing you get from them later on by spending upgrade points. But you start the game with only 2 of those, and you have to actually go out of your way to find additional healing stems in the various environments throughout the game, in special chests that you can find by exploring. And there are 2 types of these chests that you'll encounter throughout the game. The first of them are just the basic chests that you can find all over the place, some of which have to be sliced into by BD1, but most of which you can just open yourself, and those will contain things like different paint jobs for the Mantis, which is the starship that you're on, as well as different ponchos, different outfit colors, as well as different paint jobs for BD1, and of course lightsaber parts and materials so you can customize the way your lightsaber looks, although you don't find color crystals. That comes up later on in the game once you hit a certain point in the story, and then you're able to access colors apart from blue and green, or if you pre-order the game you also get access to orange. But once you hit that certain point in the storyline, you gain access to a plethora of lightsaber colors, although red is not an option because unfortunately in the current Star Wars canon you apparently cannot under any circumstances have a red lightsaber and still be a Jedi, because to get a lightsaber crystal to emit a red blade you had to pour all of your hate and rage and everything into that crystal and make it air quotes bleed, which turns the color red. Because apparently it is completely unreasonable to have a crystal just, I don't know, be naturally red in color. That would be completely absurd, right? Anyway, point is you do gain access to quite a few personalization options for your lightsaber, and while the variety of options for ponchos and outfit colors is not especially great, and the variety of paint jobs for the Mantis and BD1 aren't especially great either, they've at least done a very good job with the lightsaber options. Although it can be a bit annoying when you're exploring and you come across a chest and you open it thinking that you might find a cool lightsaber part, only to find that it's just another poncho, because there are an awful lot of ponchos in this game too. And since all of the customization options are in those chests and you can't tell what they are until you just open the chest, that can be a bit annoying. But there's no in-game currency you have to earn to pay for them, or any sort of real-world currency that you can pay to access those options. There are some things for the Deluxe Edition and the pre-order bonuses, but again, those are only cosmetic and it's barely anything anyway. So while exclusivity is a bit annoying, it's certainly not egregious like it is with a lot of other games. Anyway, I did go off on a bit of a tangent there. The other type of chests that you get access to are the ones that contain healing stems, and those you do have to go out of your way to find because they're only in secret areas. And more often than not, when you go to find these secret areas, you're going to have to go through a mini-boss first, and those are not especially difficult except early on in the game when you don't really have any sort of attack patterns memorized. Of course, even if you do have those attack patterns memorized, that's not to say that you can just run in and start swinging your lightsaber around like an idiot, because you still have to be careful not to get hit because you can only take so many hits, and those mini-bosses do a lot of damage with each hit. So let's play devil's advocate here and assume that you bumble into a particular fight and end up getting killed. Well, what's going to happen? Well, first thing that's going to happen is it's going to tell you to respawn, and you're going to respawn at the last meditation point that you saved the game at. Meditation points are more or less the same thing as bonfires in the Souls series, but with some slight tweaks. When you sit down at a meditation point, it auto-saves the game, and then you're given three options. One is to rest, which will replenish any healing stems you've lost and put your health and force energy back up to full, but it will also cause any enemies you've killed in the time since you last rested to respawn. The second option is to spend any upgrade points you've earned by just earning experience points by killing enemies or completing objectives or whatever the case may be, and use those to improve your various abilities, give yourself new combos, all that sort of thing. And then of course the third option is just to get up and leave, which you would presumably do if you were just going to a meditation point just to save your game. So if you do manage to die, then you'll respawn at whatever the last meditation point you saved at was, and in the process you will lose any experience points that you've earned up to that point, until you go back to the enemy that got the killing blow on you and hit them at least once for health damage. Once you hit that enemy for actual health damage, it restores your XP on top of whatever you've earned since you respawned, and it also replenishes your health. So unlike in, say, a Souls game where whenever you die you have to go back to wherever you ended up dying and pick up your souls that have dropped on the ground, you can actually work it into your combat tactics by gauging when you actually need to restore your health and just waiting to hit that particular enemy until you actually do need to restore your health, thereby avoiding using one of your very limited healing stems. Now that said, there are instances where an enemy isn't the one that actually lands the killing blow and forces you you to respawn. So for example, if you drop off of a cliff, then you actually lose a small amount of health and spawn back at wherever it was that you jumped off in the first place. So if you manage to die from something like that, then it will actually just place a marker on the ground wherever it was that you last fell, and you have to go and just pick it up at that point. But that's only in events like that, where it's not an enemy that gets the final blow. So if you see somebody describing this as just a Souls-like, that's not really the case. This is still very much a story-based action-adventure game that just makes use of Souls-like mechanics to make things a bit more interesting, and for the most part, everything does succeed quite well. There are occasional issues with input registration, most notably if you're not quite precise enough with them, and there are still some issues with trial-and-error gameplay occasionally getting frustrating, particularly when you're fighting certain boss enemies that have fairly cheap attack patterns, and I did notice some frame rate hitching here and there, although it was never a particularly big problem, because it usually sorted itself out within a second or two, and ordinarily when it did happen, there was a lot of stuff happening on screen at once, so it at least justified it. But really the biggest issue is going to be the very limited replay value, because once you've gone through the story, there's really nothing else to do. Once you finish the storyline, the game ends and brings you back to the main menu, upon which point you can click the continue option on the menu and it will take you back to the last location you were at before the final mission of the game, but there's no New Game Plus or any sort of other additional modes that you unlock by finishing the game, so it just ends up being pretty much just a once and done kind of deal. And if you go back and decide to mess around with the game even after you finish the storyline, the only thing left to do is just collectible hunting. And I already did most of that when I was playing through the game normally anyway, so by the time I got to the final mission, most of the areas I had gone to I had already explored at least 80% of and barely had anything left to collect. And in doing that, I finished the game in roughly 16 hours, so your mileage might vary on that a bit, but you're looking at roughly a 15-hour game in total, and that's a pretty respectable amount of time for a single-player-only action-adventure game. And when you bring all of the elements of the game together, they've done a very good job with it. It's a very solid action-adventure game that is a pretty enjoyable ride from start to finish. It does have occasional moments where it can get pretty frustrating, but that's really to be expected with a game that has a combat system like this one has. And even despite its problems, this does end up being the best Star Wars game we've had since basically Knights of the Old Republic 2. And if this is what we get for the inaugural effort of Respawn Entertainment making a Star Wars action-adventure game, I can only imagine what they're going to do with sequels, because think about it this way. Titanfall 1 was a good game, but Titanfall 2 was a far better game. So if they continue that trend with this, and they make a follow-up to this in some regard, I can only imagine how good it's going to be. I give this a 3.5 out of 5. Like I said, this is a solid game that is worth playing, but I do have a hard time recommending it at full price, precisely because there is very limited replay value. So if you can get it on sale, it's well worth picking up. Thanks for watching.